This was a new case for Detective Edmund Blackwood, and unlike the quiet mysteries that had filled his previous nights, this one carried a different and far heavier consequence. Until now, his work had existed at the edges of ordinary life, restoring order where small disturbances had quietly taken root. He had followed footsteps that did not belong, observed routines that had outlived their owners, and uncovered truths that had hidden themselves within repetition. But this time, the matter placed before him extended beyond any single life or forgotten street. This time, the resolution of the mystery would determine more than personal certainty. This time, what had vanished carried the quiet and invisible weight of a nation. It had begun on an evening that gave no sign of its importance. London existed as it always did, suspended between movement and stillness, its streets illuminated by the steady glow of lamps that neither hurried nor hesitated. Nothing in the air suggested disruption. Nothing in the city's structure hinted that somewhere, behind secured doors and silent corridors, a precise and deliberate absence had already been created. The woman who came to Blackwood that evening did not arrive in panic. Her composure was too complete for that. She carried herself with the steadiness of someone who had already passed through the first and most disorienting moments of shock and had arrived instead at something quieter, something more durable. Her presence did not disturb the calm order of the room. It settled into it as though she had understood, even before arriving, that resolution would not come from urgency, but from patience. She was the wife of the Deputy Minister of State Administration. Her husband had not disappeared. He had not fled. He had not attempted to evade the structure of the system he had served for most of his life. He remained, in fact, exactly where the system had placed him. He was in custody. The accusation had formed quickly, not because of visible violence or forced entry, but because of absence. Documents of national importance, papers whose existence alone carried consequence, had disappeared from the private ministerial office assigned to him. They had not been taken during chaos. They had not been removed during confusion or distraction. The office had remained exactly as it had been left, its order preserved, its locks intact, its surfaces undisturbed. Only the documents themselves were gone. They had last been seen upon his desk, resting where they belonged within the quiet structure of routine. No one had witnessed their removal. No unfamiliar presence had been recorded entering or leaving the secured corridors. The ministry building had followed its nightly closure with the same calm certainty it always had, sealing itself in layers of quiet protection that existed precisely to prevent such a disappearance. And yet, despite every precaution, the absence existed. Blackwood listened without interruption, allowing the shape of the situation to reveal itself gradually. He understood that disappearance, when executed without disturbance, does not belong to chaos. It belongs to precision. It belongs to someone who understands the habits of a place so completely that their movement leaves no visible interruption behind. Her certainty in her husband's innocence did not rely upon argument. It relied upon familiarity. She knew the structure of his life, the quiet consistency of his movements, the absence of deviation in his habits. He was not a man who created disruption. He was a man who preserved order, who understood that stability depended upon predictability. Routine, Blackwood knew, always leaves behind its pattern. And when something disappears from within routine, the disappearance itself becomes the only deviation. What troubled her most was not the accusation itself, but its quiet plausibility. Her husband had been the last confirmed person to see the documents. His access had been unquestioned. His presence had been expected. And in situations where access and absence align too perfectly, suspicion finds its resting place without resistance. Yet Blackwood understood something that systems often forget. Access alone does not create guilt. Access creates possibility. Later that evening, he walked alone toward the ministry building, allowing the quiet rhythm of his steps to settle into alignment with the calm structure of the city. The building stood as it always had, its stone exterior unchanged, its windows reflecting the steady glow of the lamps that illuminated the empty street. Nothing in its appearance suggested violation. Nothing suggested interruption. It remained complete. And yet somewhere within its silent corridors, a precise disturbance had already taken place. Blackwood did not believe in sudden disappearance. He believed in preparation. He believed in small adjustments made gradually, in movements carried out with patience, in routines observed closely enough to reveal their vulnerabilities. Because when something vanishes from within a place designed never to be breached, it does not vanish through force. It vanishes because someone inside had learned how to move without being seen. And somewhere within that quiet ministry, that knowledge was still waiting to be understood. There are buildings in London whose purpose is not merely to contain activity, but to preserve certainty. They exist not as places of movement, but as structures of continuity, designed to ensure that what enters remains accounted for, and what belongs within their walls cannot vanish without explanation. The ministry was such a place. It did not rely on appearance alone to project authority. Its authority existed in its predictability, in the quiet precision with which it performed its daily and nightly closure, and in the unspoken confidence that nothing within it could be disturbed without leaving evidence behind. Blackwood arrived in the late evening, at an hour when the building had already withdrawn from the visible functions of governance and entered its quieter state of preservation. Its exterior stood unchanged, its stone surfaces holding the memory of decades of uninterrupted service. The windows, darkened now, reflected only the muted glow of the street lamps, giving no indication of the corridors and offices that lay beyond them. Nothing in its appearance suggested urgency. Nothing suggested loss. Yet absence, Blackwood knew, rarely announces itself through visible disorder. He was granted entry without resistance. His presence had already been anticipated, and the system that had placed the deputy minister in custody now allowed, with equal quiet efficiency, the possibility that observation might reveal what accusation alone could not resolve. The door closed behind him with the soft finality of habit, and the interior of the ministry received him without acknowledgement. The corridors extended in quiet symmetry, their proportions balanced, their surfaces undisturbed. The lighting remained steady and without variation, illuminating each space with calm neutrality. There was no sense of intrusion here, no indication that anything had occurred beyond the ordinary progression of time. The building had preserved its own routine perfectly. Blackwood moved without haste, allowing his attention to settle upon the physical structure around him. Buildings, like people, reveal themselves through repetition. The placement of doors, the alignment of walls, the quiet logic of movement from one space to another, all of these elements form patterns that can be understood when observed without interruption. He was led to the private office that had belonged to the deputy minister. The door itself bore no sign of disturbance. Its lock had not been forced. Its surface carried only the faint and expected traces of use. When it opened, the room beyond revealed itself with the same calm order that defined the rest of the building. Nothing was out of place. The desk stood where it had always stood. The chairs remained aligned with quiet precision. Papers rested in careful arrangement, their positions unchanged. The window, set into the far wall, reflected the dim suggestion of the street beyond. The room did not feel abandoned. It felt paused. Blackwood stepped inside and allowed the stillness to settle fully around him. This was where the documents had last existed. He did not begin by searching. He began by observing. Search implies urgency. Observation allows structure to reveal itself. He approached the desk slowly, his attention resting not upon the absence itself, but upon the presence of everything else. Objects that remain undisturbed often reveal more than those that have been moved. The surface of the desk bore no irregular marks. The papers that remained were aligned with the quiet discipline of routine. Nothing suggested haste. Nothing suggested concealment. He allowed his gaze to move to the edges of the room. The walls remained unchanged. The door remained closed behind him. The window remained secured. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had entered this space without belonging here, which meant, by quiet and unavoidable conclusion, that whoever had removed the documents had not entered as an intruder. They had entered as someone expected. Blackwood understood that buildings such as this one do not fail suddenly. Their routines are designed to anticipate interruption. Their security exists not in visible barriers alone, but in predictability. Guards follow precise paths. Doors close at precise hours. Access exists within clearly defined limits. For something to disappear within such a system, it must do so without disrupting the system itself. He moved toward the window and stood before it, allowing himself to look outward. The street beyond existed in calm continuity, unaware of the quiet disturbance that had already taken place within the building. The lamps cast their steady glow upon the pavement. Nothing in the exterior world reflected the absence contained within this room. He turned his attention back to the interior. There were no hidden compartments visible within the desk. No displaced objects. No indication that the documents had been concealed within the room itself. This absence had not been created through concealment. It had been created through removal, which meant that the documents had left this room, and yet no one had seen them leave. This was the quiet contradiction that defined the mystery. Blackwood understood that movement, when executed with sufficient familiarity, becomes indistinguishable from routine. A person who belongs within a place is not observed in the same way as someone who does not. Their presence does not disrupt expectation. It fulfills it, which meant that whoever had taken the documents had relied not upon force, but upon belonging. They had walked within these corridors without interruption. They had entered this room without hesitation. They had removed what did not belong to them, and they had left without leaving anything behind except the quiet certainty of absence. Blackwood remained within the stillness of the office for several moments longer, allowing the structure of the place to settle into his understanding. He was not searching for the moment of disappearance. He was searching for the moment when disappearance had first become possible. Because routine, once understood completely, reveals not only what belongs within it, but also who has learned how to move through it unseen. There are places where nothing appears to happen, and yet everything depends upon how movement is permitted. The ministry, in its quiet after-hours order, did not feel like a building designed to chase danger. It felt like a building designed to prevent it through routine. Its corridors were not merely passages between rooms. They were instruments of predictability. Doors aligned in deliberate sequence. Corners revealed themselves without surprise. The very geometry of the interior seemed intended to discourage irregularity by making every step part of an expected rhythm. Blackwood understood that if the documents had left the deputy minister's office without disturbance, the path they took mattered more than the moment they vanished. A disappearance without force is rarely an act performed in haste. It is an act performed in confidence, relying upon the quiet certainty that no one will question a familiar presence moving through familiar space. He began to walk the corridor outside the office slowly, allowing his attention to rest upon details that most people ignore precisely because they remain unchanged. The lighting was steady. The carpet held a faint pattern, worn softly along the center line where years of footsteps had passed. The walls bore no decoration that demanded attention. Everything here was designed to support order, not to distract from it. Yet even the most orderly corridor reveals its secrets when observed with patience. Blackwood followed the route that a person would take if they wished to leave the office carrying something of importance. He did not imagine a thief running. He imagined someone walking, calm and unhurried, holding documents as though they belonged to them, moving in the same measured way as any official moving between rooms. Such movement draws no attention because it satisfies expectation. The corridor led toward a broader intersection where several passageways met. From there, one path continued toward the secured records wing, another toward administrative offices, and another toward a stairwell that descended toward the ground floor exit. Blackwood paused there, not because the choice was unclear, but because each option revealed something different about the nature of access. If the documents had been taken toward the record's wing, it would suggest concealment within the ministry. If they had been taken toward administrative offices, it would suggest transfer to another person inside. If they had been taken toward the stairwell, it would suggest removal from the building itself. Yet the ministry had seen no disturbance at its exits. No guard had reported an unusual departure, which meant that if the documents had left the building, they had done so in a manner indistinguishable from the ordinary movement of trusted staff. Blackwood continued along the corridor toward the stairwell. The door to it was plain, designed not to invite attention. The handle showed faint wear, suggesting regular use. Nothing about it suggested secrecy. It was in fact the opposite. It was part of the building's routine, used daily by those who belonged within it. He opened it quietly and stepped inside. The stairwell was narrow and steady in its proportions, lit by a simple overhead fixture. Its walls were bare. Its air carried a mild coolness that belonged to spaces that exist primarily for movement rather than occupation. Blackwood descended slowly, listening not for sound, but for the absence of it. In a place like this, echoes often reveal how frequently a path is used. Here, the steps did not echo dramatically. The space absorbed sound in a way that suggested familiarity. At the bottom of the stairwell, another corridor opened toward the ground floor. This level felt different. The upper floors had carried the calm authority of closed offices and private work. Here, the building's relationship to the outside world became more immediate. Doors were heavier. Security points existed at measured intervals. A sense of boundary lay within the architecture itself. Blackwood walked toward the main exit and paused at the point where guards were stationed. Their presence was quiet, professional, and without unnecessary motion. They did not patrol with visible suspicion. They remained as part of the building's predictable closure. Their routines were designed to prevent the very thing Blackwood was investigating, and yet the documents had vanished anyway. He observed the entry log, not expecting to find a name marked boldly as guilty, but expecting to find the more subtle shape of routine. Most entries were predictable: late meetings, administrative check-ins, the occasional maintenance staff. These were ordinary movements through an ordinary system. The difficulty lay in the fact that the thief would not appear as an intruder. They would appear as someone who belonged. Blackwood returned his attention to the building's internal structure. If a person had walked out carrying the documents, they would have needed to pass through this boundary. They would have needed to satisfy the expectations of the guards without raising even mild curiosity. That meant their identity, their posture, their presence, and the manner in which they carried what they carried would all have needed to align perfectly with routine. Such alignment does not happen by chance. It happens through knowledge. Blackwood began to consider not merely who had access, but who had familiarity deep enough to predict the small details that guards notice unconsciously: the rhythm of footsteps, the pace of a walk, the confidence of a hand upon a door. These are the things that distinguish belonging from intrusion, and they are rarely recorded because they are rarely questioned. He walked back up the stairwell at the same unhurried pace, allowing himself to feel the difference between levels of the building as he ascended. Upstairs, the air seemed quieter. The corridors felt more contained. The very stillness of the ministerial floor suggested that disturbance would be noticed if it introduced even the smallest irregularity. And yet the disturbance had occurred, which meant, again, that it had not introduced irregularity at all. Blackwood returned to the corridor outside the deputy minister's office and paused, allowing his gaze to rest upon the closed door. In his mind, he traced the simplest possible version of the disappearance: a familiar person entering the office at a time when their presence would not be questioned, removing the documents calmly, and leaving along a path the building would recognize as normal. The solution would not be found in broken locks or scattered objects. It would be found in the exact point where routine had been used against itself. There are systems that rely not on strength, but on repetition. Their security does not come from barriers alone, but from the expectation that every movement within them follows a known pattern. The ministry existed within such a system. It was not protected by visible force as much as it was protected by predictability. Doors opened at expected hours. Corridors remained occupied only when necessary. Guards maintained positions not to confront intrusion, but to confirm continuity. It was a structure designed to recognize disturbance by its absence from routine. Blackwood understood that the disappearance of the documents had not required the breaking of this system. It had required the opposite. It had required someone to move within it so precisely that their presence became indistinguishable from what was expected. He remained on the ministerial floor long after the last official movement of the evening had ended. The building had entered its quieter state, the phase in which its purpose shifted from activity to preservation. Lights remained steady, illuminating corridors that no longer required illumination for work, but for structure. Silence settled naturally into place, not as an interruption, but as a continuation of order. He began to observe the timing of routine itself. Security within the ministry did not exist as a single continuous barrier. It existed as a sequence of small, repeated confirmations. Guards moved along established paths. Doors were checked at regular intervals. Access points were monitored not constantly, but rhythmically. These rhythms created the illusion of complete coverage, yet they also created predictable intervals between observation. Predictability, Blackwood knew, is both protection and vulnerability. He positioned himself at a point along the corridor where he could observe without interruption, allowing the building's routine to unfold without influence. He watched as a guard completed his circuit, pausing briefly at each door, not to question its existence, but to confirm its unchanged state. The guard did not linger. He did not search. He confirmed continuity and moved on. This was the nature of the system. It did not assume disruption unless disruption announced itself. Blackwood followed the guard's path at a distance, not intruding, but aligning himself with the structure of movement that defined the building. He observed how long the guard remained away from any given point. He observed how naturally the building settled into stillness between each circuit. There were moments, small, quiet moments, when no one observed the corridor at all. These moments were not errors. They were part of the design. A system built on routine does not expect betrayal from within. Blackwood returned to the deputy minister's office and stood before its closed door once more. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he allowed himself to consider the timing of its vulnerability. The office did not need to be forced open. It needed only to be entered during a moment when entry would not be questioned. He imagined the simplest version of the act. A familiar person walking along the corridor. A familiar hand opening the door. A familiar presence entering and leaving without hesitation. The removal of the documents would not have required speed. Speed invites attention. It would have required calm, the kind of calm that belongs to someone who has no reason to expect interruption. Blackwood opened the door and stepped inside. The room remained exactly as it had been left, its order preserved with quiet precision. The desk held its remaining papers in careful arrangement. The chair stood slightly withdrawn, as though its occupant had risen with the intention of returning. Nothing in the room suggested violation, and yet the absence remained. He moved toward the desk once more and allowed his attention to settle upon its surface, not searching for what had been taken, but considering how easily it could have been taken. The documents, when present, would not have drawn attention simply by existing there. They would have appeared as part of the office's natural order, indistinguishable from the countless other papers that passed through ministerial hands each day, which meant that their removal, if done correctly, would not have drawn attention either. Removal, when aligned with routine, becomes invisible. Blackwood turned his attention to the door behind him. Its position relative to the desk, its angle within the room, and the quiet alignment of the corridor beyond all confirmed the same conclusion. Whoever had entered this space had done so without needing to conceal themselves. Their presence here had not required secrecy. It had required belonging. He stepped back into the corridor and closed the door gently behind him. The building continued its quiet cycle of preservation. The guard would return along his path soon, confirming once more that everything remained in its expected state. He would see nothing unusual. He would record nothing unusual. And in doing so, he would confirm the illusion that nothing had changed. Blackwood understood then that the act had not been committed against the system. It had been committed through it. The thief had not defeated the ministry's routine. They had relied upon it, which meant that the answer would not be found by searching for intrusion. It would be found by understanding who, within that structure, had possessed the knowledge and the opportunity to move without ever appearing out of place. There are moments in any careful investigation when attention must turn away from the place itself and toward the people who move within it. Buildings, no matter how secure, do not create disappearance on their own. They only allow or prevent the movements of those who belong inside them. The ministry had already revealed its structure with quiet clarity. Its corridors had shown no sign of intrusion. Its doors had remained intact. Its routine had continued without interruption. What remained now was to understand who, within that routine, had possessed the quiet authority to move freely enough to remove something without disturbing expectation. Blackwood understood that access is rarely a matter of keys alone. It is a matter of familiarity, of recognition, of presence that does not invite scrutiny. A person who belongs within a place moves differently from one who does not. Their steps carry no hesitation. Their posture reflects certainty. Their presence satisfies the quiet assumptions that govern structured environments. He requested and was granted access to the internal registry of authorized personnel. The list itself did not attempt to conceal its simplicity. It contained names, positions, levels of access, and the quiet hierarchy that determined who could enter certain rooms without question. The deputy minister's office had not been open to the entire ministry. Its access had been limited to a small and carefully defined group: the deputy minister himself, his immediate administrative assistant, 2 senior clerks responsible for document management, and a small number of security personnel whose duties required periodic entry. Each of these individuals belonged within the building. Each of them possessed the authority to move without disruption. Blackwood did not search the list for guilt. He searched it for pattern. Routine reveals itself not through singular action, but through repetition over time. He examined the schedule of each authorized individual, noting their usual hours of presence, their expected movements, and the quiet rhythm of their work within the ministry's structure. Most of them followed consistent and predictable patterns. They arrived at established hours. They departed without deviation. Their presence aligned with expectations so completely that it became invisible. Such invisibility, Blackwood knew, could be used in more than one way. He continued his observation late into the evening, allowing the ministry's reduced activity to clarify the distinction between necessity and habit. The administrative assistant had departed at her usual hour, her role confined to daytime function. The clerks had completed their work and left without delay. Security personnel maintained their quiet cycles of movement, their presence steady but impersonal. No one remained whose presence did not belong, which meant that whoever had taken the documents had done so at a time when their presence had been expected. This realization did not narrow the list. It refined its meaning. Blackwood began to consider not only who had access, but who had opportunity to observe the building's routine closely enough to understand its quiet intervals. Familiarity of that kind rarely develops quickly. It develops through repeated exposure, through patient observation of how systems behave when no one believes they are being studied. He allowed his attention to return briefly to the woman who had come to him. Her certainty in her husband's innocence had not been defensive. It had been structural, grounded in her knowledge of his habits and his adherence to routine. He had not been a man who moved unpredictably. His life had followed patterns shaped by discipline and repetition, which meant that if the documents had vanished through calculated action, the act had not belonged to him. It had belonged to someone whose movements existed alongside his own, someone who understood his routine not as an outsider might observe it, but as someone who had lived near its edges long enough to anticipate it. Blackwood returned once more to the corridor outside the deputy minister's office and stood there without movement. The door remained closed. The building remained calm. Nothing in its structure acknowledged the absence that had already reshaped the course of accusation. He considered how easily a person with proper access could have entered this space at the correct moment, removed what they came for, and left without interruption. The act required no violence. It required only confidence and knowledge. Confidence is not easily imitated. It belongs most naturally to those who believe they have the right to be present. Blackwood understood that the answer would not emerge from the building itself. The building had already revealed everything it could reveal. What remained was to understand the human structure that existed around it, the network of familiarity, trust, and proximity that allowed movement without question. Because disappearance of this kind does not belong to strangers. It belongs to someone who had stood within this space before, whose presence had never been questioned, and whose knowledge of routine had been complete enough to make absence appear natural. There are individuals whose presence within a secure building exists not as part of its formal structure, but as part of its accepted environment. They do not appear on primary lists of authority. They do not hold positions that grant them direct responsibility over documents or decisions. And yet, through familiarity and repetition, they become known to the building itself. Their movement does not interrupt expectation. It fulfills it in quieter ways. Blackwood understood that official access alone did not fully define who belonged within the ministry. There existed a second category of presence, those who were not essential to the building's function, yet whose regular appearances had been absorbed into its routine. Such individuals were rarely questioned because their presence had never before required explanation. He began to review not only the registry of access, but the informal patterns that existed around it. Visitors to the ministry were recorded, but their purpose was rarely examined beyond the moment of entry. Meetings occurred. Conversations ended. People departed. Over time, certain names appeared more frequently than others, not because they held official roles, but because they had reason to return. These repeated presences formed their own quiet pattern, one that existed alongside the ministry's formal structure without disrupting it. Blackwood observed these names carefully. Most appeared rarely, their visits separated by weeks or months. Their presence had the quality of necessity rather than habit. But among them were others whose appearances followed a more regular rhythm. They did not belong to the ministry, yet they were familiar to it. Guards recognized them. Clerks expected them. Their presence did not require scrutiny because it had already been accepted. One such name appeared with quiet consistency. It belonged to a man who held no official position within the government. He was neither employee nor administrator. His visits were recorded as personal, connected not to policy, but to relationship. He had arrived during daylight hours, departed without delay, and had never remained beyond the ministry's formal closure. There was nothing in the record to suggest suspicion, and yet repetition, when examined closely, reveals structure. Blackwood noted the timing of these visits. They did not occur randomly. They aligned with days when the deputy minister's schedule had remained confined to his private office. The visits had been brief. Their purpose had not been questioned. Their presence had been absorbed into routine. Familiarity had protected them. Blackwood walked once more through the ministry corridors, allowing his attention to settle upon the quiet mechanics of recognition. Guards did not study every face equally. They studied deviation. They noticed what did not belong. Those who belonged, or appeared to belong, moved without interruption. He considered how easily a person could learn the rhythm of such a building through repeated visits. They would observe which guards stood at which posts. They would notice when corridors remained briefly unattended. They would understand how long doors remained closed and when movement passed without question. Knowledge of this kind does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly, through presence alone. Blackwood returned to the deputy minister's office and stood once more within its preserved stillness. The desk remained unchanged. The chair remained withdrawn. The absence remained complete. He imagined the simplest version of the act once again, but this time with greater clarity. A person whose presence had already been accepted enters the ministry during an ordinary visit. They move through familiar corridors. They observe without appearing to observe. They learn without appearing to learn. And eventually, they understand enough. Understanding creates opportunity. Opportunity creates absence. He stepped back into the corridor and allowed his attention to settle upon the path that led toward the building's exit. The ministry did not protect itself against those it trusted. It did not question the familiar. It did not resist those who moved as though they belonged. This was not a failure of security. It was a consequence of certainty. Blackwood understood now that the disappearance had not begun on the night the documents vanished. It had begun earlier, during quieter moments, when someone had stood within these corridors and learned the building's patterns without drawing attention. The act itself had been simple. Preparation had made it possible. He returned to the registry once more, his attention resting upon the repeated name. The man had not entered the ministry on the night the documents vanished. His presence had not been recorded during the critical hour, which meant something more precise. He had not needed to be present at the moment of disappearance. He had needed only to know exactly when disappearance could occur. Routine, when observed closely enough, reveals not only what is protected, but when protection briefly becomes expectation alone. And someone, somewhere within the quiet structure of familiarity, had learned exactly how to use that knowledge. There is a difference between access that is granted by authority and access that is granted by familiarity. Authority is recorded, documented, and structured. Familiarity, by contrast, develops quietly. It does not announce itself through official designation. It emerges through repetition, through presence that becomes so consistent it ceases to attract attention. Blackwood understood that the ministry, for all its visible layers of security, depended just as heavily on recognition as it did on restriction. A face seen often enough becomes part of the building's expectation. He returned again to the visitor registry, not to confirm who had entered on the night the documents disappeared, but to understand who had entered often enough to learn the ministry's quiet rhythms. The record did not attempt to conceal its information. Names appeared in careful sequence, each attached to a date, a time of arrival, and a time of departure. Most entries carried the ordinary irregularity of occasional presence. But one name appeared with a calm consistency that stood apart, not through frequency alone, but through pattern. The visits had occurred regularly over the course of several months. They were not clustered within a single period of urgency. They were distributed with the quiet patience of routine. Each visit had been brief. Each had taken place during hours when the deputy minister remained inside his office. Each had been recorded without comment or suspicion. The man had never stayed long enough to disrupt expectation. He had stayed long enough to observe it. Blackwood allowed his attention to rest upon the spacing between the visits. The intervals were neither accidental nor rigid. They reflected the rhythm of someone who did not wish to appear dependent upon access, yet wished to maintain familiarity with the place itself. Too frequent a presence invites attention. Too rare a presence prevents understanding. The balance between the two creates invisibility. He walked again through the ministry corridors, allowing his thoughts to align with the physical structure of the building. The walls remained unchanged. The doors remained closed. The lamps cast their steady, neutral light upon the floor. Nothing in the building's appearance acknowledged the disappearance that had already reshaped its internal certainty. And yet the building had already revealed something essential. It had revealed that belonging is not always defined by position. It is defined by acceptance. Blackwood paused near the stairwell and considered how recognition develops. Guards do not study every visitor equally. Their attention rests upon irregularity. When a presence becomes expected, it no longer requires examination. A person who enters often enough ceases to be seen as a visitor. They become part of the building's quiet environment. This man had entered often enough. He had walked these corridors without interruption. He had stood near the deputy minister's office without raising concern. And in doing so, he had learned the building's habits with quiet precision. Blackwood returned his attention to the timeline surrounding the disappearance itself. The documents had last been seen late in the evening, at an hour when most administrative staff had already departed. The building had entered its quieter state, when movement became more limited, but not impossible. The deputy minister himself had left soon after, following the same predictable routine that had defined his work for years. The removal of the documents had occurred after that moment, which meant that whoever had taken them had done so with knowledge of his departure. Knowledge of that kind does not belong to strangers. It belongs to those who understand not only the building, but the person within it. Blackwood began to consider proximity not merely in terms of access, but in terms of personal familiarity. A person who knows when a man leaves his office without being told does not learn that knowledge through observation alone. They learn it through relationship. They learn it through time spent near the edges of routine, where pattern becomes visible. He stood once more before the closed door of the deputy minister's office and allowed his thoughts to settle into quiet alignment. The room beyond remained unchanged. Its absence remained complete. Yet the shape of possibility had grown clearer. This had not been the act of someone forcing entry into a guarded system. It had been the act of someone moving through a familiar place at a familiar time, guided not by urgency, but by certainty. Blackwood returned to the registry again and studied the name once more. It did not belong to an official. It did not belong to a member of the ministry staff. It belonged to someone whose presence existed at the edge of authority, close enough to enter, but distant enough to avoid scrutiny. Someone who had belonged without ever being accountable. Routine had accepted him. Recognition had protected him. And somewhere within that quiet acceptance, he had learned enough to understand exactly when absence could be created without resistance. There are forms of access that exist beyond keys, beyond authorization, and beyond official record. They emerge not from position, but from repetition. A person who appears often enough in a place of authority becomes absorbed into its quiet expectations. Their presence ceases to interrupt the natural order of movement. They are not admitted with hesitation. They are received as continuation. Blackwood understood that the ministry had not failed through weakness, but through certainty. Its structure had been designed to prevent intrusion, not familiarity. Its guards had watched for irregular movement, not repeated presence. Its systems had been constructed to recognize threat, not trust. And yet trust, once established, creates pathways that no formal system is designed to question. He remained within the building long after its evening stillness had settled into permanence, allowing his attention to move beyond its physical structure and toward the quieter architecture of human behavior. The corridors remained unchanged, their steady symmetry reinforcing the illusion that nothing had ever been disturbed. The office doors remained closed, their silence preserving the continuity of routine. Nothing in the building acknowledged the absence that had already reshaped its internal certainty. And yet Blackwood no longer searched the building for what had been taken. He searched it for who had been allowed to remain. The repeated name in the visitor registry no longer appeared as a simple administrative detail. It had become something more significant, not because of its official importance, but because of its quiet consistency. The visits had not been driven by urgency. They had followed no visible crisis. They had emerged gradually, spaced with careful patience, allowing familiarity to develop without attracting scrutiny. This was not the behavior of someone seeking immediate opportunity. It was the behavior of someone learning. Learning does not require instruction when observation is enough. A person who enters a building repeatedly begins, without intention, to understand its rhythm. They learn when corridors fall silent. They learn which doors remain closed and which open without hesitation. They learn how guards shift their attention, how routine creates intervals of quiet certainty in which movement becomes invisible. Blackwood understood that knowledge of this kind is rarely recognized while it forms. It develops in stillness, carried forward by repetition, until it becomes complete enough to guide action without uncertainty. He walked again along the corridor that led to the deputy minister's office, allowing his pace to align with the quiet tempo of the place itself. The carpet beneath his steps carried the faint memory of countless passages, none of which had left visible interruption. The lamps above him held their steady light without variation. Everything within the building existed as continuation. It was this continuity that had made the disappearance possible. A stranger entering this space would have been noticed, if not immediately, then eventually. Hesitation reveals unfamiliarity. Uncertainty alters movement. But someone who had walked these corridors often enough would carry no such hesitation. Their steps would align naturally with expectation. Their presence would complete the pattern rather than disturb it. Blackwood paused near the office door and allowed his thoughts to settle fully. The man whose name appeared so often in the registry had not needed authority. He had needed only acceptance. His presence had existed alongside the ministry's routine long enough to be absorbed into it. Guards had seen him before. Clerks had recognized him without question. Doors had opened without resistance because they had opened for him many times already. This was how belonging is created, not through permission alone, but through repetition that becomes indistinguishable from necessity. Blackwood understood now that the removal of the documents had not required deception in the traditional sense. It had required only timing and certainty. The man had not needed to force entry into a guarded system. He had needed only to move within it at the correct moment, carrying the quiet confidence of someone whose presence had never been questioned before. He turned and walked slowly back toward the stairwell, allowing the full structure of the realization to settle into clarity. The building had not been breached. It had not been overcome. It had continued to function exactly as it had always functioned, preserving order, maintaining routine, and protecting itself against threats it understood. But it had never been designed to protect itself against someone who had become part of its expectation. Trust, once established, removes the need for concealment. It allows movement to occur openly, without resistance, and without memory. And somewhere beyond the ministry's silent corridors, the man whose presence had once belonged so naturally within them now existed beyond its reach, carrying with him the quiet absence that had already begun to alter the course of events far beyond the building itself. There are routines that exist long before they ever touch the walls of institutions. They begin in quieter places, in homes and conversations and shared histories that develop without record or scrutiny. Blackwood understood that the repeated presence within the ministry had not originated there. It had originated elsewhere, in a life that ran parallel to authority without formally belonging to it. The building had not created the familiarity. It had merely received it. He walked that evening through a quieter residential district, where the structure of London softened into rows of townhouses that held their own private continuities. The street lamps cast their steady glow upon pavement that had known years of unremarkable passage. Nothing in the street announced its connection to the ministry. Nothing suggested its proximity to decisions that shaped the quiet balance of power beyond its reach. And yet this was where the pattern had begun. The home of the deputy minister stood among others identical in proportion and restraint, its exterior unchanged by the events that had altered the structure of his life. The windows reflected only the calm presence of the street itself. The door remained closed, preserving the stillness within. It was not a place of secrecy. It was a place of routine. Blackwood did not enter immediately. He allowed himself first to observe the structure of the place, not as an investigator seeking evidence, but as an observer seeking continuity. Homes reveal their truth through repetition just as buildings of authority do. The wear of steps upon stone, the quiet alignment of objects visible through glass, the presence of order that reflects lives lived within predictable rhythm. This had been the origin of the trust. The woman who had come to him had spoken not with fear, but with certainty. Her conviction had rested upon years of familiarity with her husband's habits. She had known his movements not as records know them, but as proximity knows them. Her confidence had not required proof because routine itself had provided it. Yet proximity, Blackwood knew, rarely exists in isolation. It creates circles of familiarity that extend outward, drawing others into its quiet structure. He considered the repeated name once more, allowing its presence in the ministry's registry to align with its likely presence here. The man had not entered the ministry as an official. He had entered as someone connected to the life that existed beyond it. His familiarity with the building had been granted through relationship, not through position. Relationship grants access in ways authority cannot regulate. Blackwood understood now that the ministry had never needed to question him because he had never appeared as an outsider. He had arrived under the quiet protection of belonging. His visits had not introduced disruption. They had continued a pattern already established elsewhere. He remained outside the house for several moments longer, allowing the quiet structure of its existence to settle fully into his understanding. The disappearance of the documents had not been an isolated act. It had been the natural extension of familiarity that had developed gradually through repeated presence near both the man accused and the place from which the documents had vanished. Preparation had not occurred within the ministry alone. It had begun here, in the quiet spaces where routine forms without observation. Blackwood turned and began to walk slowly along the street, allowing his thoughts to align with the realization now emerging with greater clarity. The removal of the documents had required knowledge not only of the building, but of the man himself. It had required understanding his schedule, his habits, and the quiet consistency with which he moved through his life. Such knowledge belongs most naturally to those closest to us, not to strangers, not to intruders, but to those who have stood beside us long enough to learn the shape of our certainty. The repeated visits to the ministry had not been necessary to gain access alone. They had been necessary to confirm timing, to align knowledge with opportunity, and to ensure that when the moment arrived, the act could be completed without hesitation. Blackwood understood that the disappearance had not been an act of impulse. It had been the final movement of a routine that had been forming quietly for months. Each visit had refined familiarity. Each observation had reduced uncertainty. Each moment of acceptance had brought the man closer to understanding exactly when and how absence could be created without resistance. He paused at the end of the street and allowed himself one final glance back toward the house. It remained unchanged, its quiet exterior preserving the illusion that nothing beyond its walls had altered. And yet its connection to the ministry had already reshaped events beyond its reach. Trust, when extended without question, creates pathways that do not appear on official record. And somewhere within the quiet structure of that trust, the man whose presence had once been accepted without hesitation had learned enough to transform familiarity into opportunity and opportunity into disappearance. There are relationships that exist so close to ordinary life that they become almost invisible. Family, in particular, moves within spaces where formality weakens and certainty replaces scrutiny. A brother may enter a home without explanation. He may sit in a familiar room without being asked why he has come. He may be present often enough that his presence ceases to register as an event. Blackwood understood that if someone had learned the rhythms of the deputy minister's life with sufficient precision to exploit them, it would most likely have been someone who had never needed permission to be near. He returned his attention to the woman at the center of the case, not to challenge her certainty, but to understand the quiet circle of familiarity that surrounded her. The ministry had already suggested that the disappearance could only have occurred through belonging. Now the question became simpler and more delicate. To whom had belonging been granted without ever being examined? Her household had not been a place of secrecy. It had been a place of routine. Yet routine, when undisturbed, does not question itself. It assumes its own safety because it has never been forced to consider the alternative. Blackwood understood that trust within a home does not develop through proof. It develops through repetition until it becomes a silent law. Within that law, her brother had always existed. His presence in the visitor registry of the ministry had not been recorded as suspicious. It had been recorded as personal. His visits had aligned with days when the deputy minister remained in his office, and the records had reflected this without comment because there was nothing in the building's routine designed to question family connection. The ministry did not resist him, not because it was careless, but because familiarity had already rendered him ordinary. Blackwood considered what this meant in practical terms. A man who visits his sister often learns the shape of her household's rhythm. He learns when she rises, when she sleeps, when her husband returns, and when he departs. These details are not given deliberately. They are simply present, available to anyone who belongs closely enough to observe them without appearing to observe. He also learns what is spoken casually, without awareness of consequence. The pressures of office, the frustrations of bureaucratic delay, the quiet mention of meetings, schedules, or deadlines. These fragments, harmless in ordinary conversation, can become valuable when assembled by someone who listens with intention rather than affection. Blackwood did not allow himself to assume guilt from proximity alone. Yet he understood that opportunity forms most naturally where trust is greatest. The brothers' repeated presence within both the home and the ministry had placed him in a position of quiet advantage. He had been able to observe the deputy minister's schedule. He had been able to study the building's routine. He had been able to move within its corridors under the protection of recognition. Most importantly, he had been able to remain unexamined. Blackwood returned in thought to the ministerial office itself. The documents had vanished without disturbance, which meant they had been removed by someone who could enter without creating alarm. A family visitor, known by guards and clerks, could pass through corridors with an ease that a stranger could never imitate. His visits had refined that ease into certainty. The building had learned his face. Its routine had learned his presence. Preparation had made him invisible. What remained was motive. Blackwood understood that motive in cases of state documents rarely begins with ideology alone. Ideology may justify action, but it does not always initiate it. The act described here was not chaotic. It was calculated, quiet, and patient. Such acts often arise from something colder, the value of information, and the certainty that someone beyond the nation's walls would pay dearly for what belonged within them. A man standing close enough to power without holding it can feel its weight without possessing its protection. He can see wealth and authority around him, yet remain outside it. In such a position, the temptation to convert proximity into profit becomes not dramatic, but gradual. A thought repeated often enough becomes intention. Intention refined over time becomes plan. Blackwood allowed these considerations to settle into the calm structure of his mind, aware that the case had reached a point where the answer was no longer hidden in the building. It was hidden within the quiet, ordinary relationships that surrounded it. The woman's certainty in her husband's innocence remained intact, yet Blackwood understood that innocence of one person does not prevent betrayal by another. Sometimes, the most damaging act does not arrive from an enemy across borders, but from someone who has stood close enough to hear the rhythm of your life and to learn exactly when that rhythm can be used against you. Within that understanding, the pattern became clearer. The brother had always been nearby, and in that closeness, the path from familiarity to betrayal had been quietly, patiently formed. There are visits that exist for clear and ordinary reasons, and there are others whose purpose reveals itself only when examined long after they have ended. Blackwood understood that the brothers' repeated presence at the ministry could not be dismissed as coincidence. Familiarity alone explains access, but it does not explain persistence. Persistence suggests intention, and intention, when carried forward quietly, often disguises itself as habit. He returned once more to the registry, this time not to study the frequency of the visits, but to study their placement in time. Dates, when observed without context, appear neutral. But when aligned with the movements of others, they begin to reveal structure. He compared the brothers' visits to the known schedule of the deputy minister, observing where the two patterns intersected and where they diverged. Most of the visits had occurred during ordinary working hours, when corridors remained active and offices remained open. Such visits offered opportunity for observation, but not for action. They allowed familiarity to deepen, but they did not provide the isolation required for removal. Yet there was one visit that differed slightly from the others, not in duration, but in timing. It had taken place on the evening before the disappearance. The record itself did not suggest urgency. The brother had arrived during late hours, when most administrative work had already concluded. His presence had been acknowledged without hesitation. He had departed before the building's final closure, leaving behind no indication that his visit had differed from any previous one. And yet Blackwood understood that timing rarely aligns itself so precisely without reason. He walked again through the corridor outside the deputy minister's office, allowing the memory of that evening to reconstruct itself within the structure of the place. The building would have been quieter then. Staff would have been preparing to leave. Guards would have followed their predictable circuits. The office itself would have remained accessible to those already accepted within its routine. A visit during such an hour does not attract attention. It completes expectation. Blackwood paused at the office door and allowed his thoughts to settle fully. The brother had not needed to remove the documents immediately. Removal requires opportunity, but preparation requires only access. A man who enters an office briefly can observe more than he appears to observe. He can confirm where documents are placed. He can confirm how they are handled. He can confirm how easily they may later be taken without interruption. Preparation does not leave visible trace. It leaves only certainty. Blackwood understood that the act itself had likely occurred not during that visit, but after it. The brother had needed only to confirm that the documents existed and that their placement remained predictable. Once confirmed, the act of removal could be executed later, during a moment when the building's quiet routine provided its own protection. He considered how such removal might have occurred. The brother did not possess official authorization to remain after hours, but he did possess something more valuable: recognition. Guards who had seen him many times before would not question his presence immediately. Clerks who had spoken with him before would not find his appearance unusual. The building had accepted him gradually, and in doing so, had surrendered the vigilance it reserved for strangers. Blackwood turned and walked slowly toward the stairwell, allowing his thoughts to align with the physical structure around him. The ministry had not been deceived through force. It had been deceived through patience. The brother had not needed to invent a false identity or create elaborate concealment. He had needed only to remain himself, moving within a system that had already learned to trust him. Trust, once established, becomes its own form of access. What remained now was to understand how the brother had been able to return without record, or whether he had needed to return at all. The disappearance had occurred during the night, but entry logs did not show his presence at that hour. This absence did not contradict possibility. It refined it. It suggested that the documents may not have been removed during the night of disappearance alone. They may have been prepared for removal earlier, placed somewhere within reach, somewhere outside the immediate scrutiny of the office, waiting for the moment when final removal could occur without interruption. Blackwood paused at the base of the stairwell and allowed himself to consider the simplicity of such an act. The brother would not have needed to defeat the building's security. He would have needed only to work within its expectations, moving calmly, preparing quietly, and waiting patiently until absence became inevitable. He understood now that the visit on the evening before the disappearance had not been routine. It had been confirmation. Confirmation that preparation was complete. Confirmation that the building remained predictable. Confirmation that when the moment arrived, nothing would prevent the quiet transformation of familiarity into betrayal. And somewhere beyond the ministry's silent corridors, The brother had already begun to carry forward the final step of a plan that had been forming long before anyone realized that anything had been taken at all. There are moments in an investigation when suspicion does not arrive suddenly, but settles gradually into clarity. It does not announce itself through dramatic discovery. It emerges quietly as each small observation aligns with the next, forming a structure that no longer requires assumption. Blackwood understood that the brother's repeated presence, his familiarity with the ministry, and the timing of his final recorded visit had already shaped the outline of possibility. What remained now was not to prove access, but to understand intention. Intention rarely reveals itself within the place where the act occurred. It reveals itself in the life that surrounds the person who carried it forward. Blackwood turned his attention toward the brother's routine beyond the ministry. Unlike officials whose lives are structured by predictable schedules, the brother existed within a quieter and less regulated pattern. His days were not recorded with institutional precision. His movements were not constrained by obligation. Yet even lives without formal structure develop habits of their own, and habit, when observed carefully, reveals change. He began by examining the brother's recent movements, not through confrontation, but through observation. Patterns that remain consistent over time rarely conceal anything. It is deviation that introduces meaning. Over the past several months, the brother had maintained an ordinary existence. His presence in familiar places had remained steady. His routines had aligned with expectation. But in the days following the disappearance, something had shifted. The shift was not dramatic. It did not announce itself through sudden absence or visible flight. Instead, it appeared in smaller adjustments. His movements became less predictable. His visits to familiar locations grew less frequent. He had not vanished, but he had begun to detach himself from the quiet repetition that had previously defined his days. This was not the behavior of someone unaware of consequence. It was the behavior of someone waiting. Waiting does not always involve departure. Sometimes it involves remaining still long enough for suspicion to settle elsewhere. The deputy minister had already been placed in custody. The system had accepted its explanation. The accusation had given structure to uncertainty, which meant that the brother, for the moment, remained invisible. Blackwood understood that acts of betrayal committed for personal gain often follow a predictable psychological rhythm. The act itself is carried out with careful precision. The aftermath is governed by patience. The individual does not rush toward escape. Escape invites attention. Instead, they remain near the familiar, trusting that the absence they created will continue to conceal them. He walked again through the quiet streets that connected the brother's life to the ministry, allowing his thoughts to align with the physical geography of the case. The distance between the brother's home and the building was not great. It could be crossed easily, without urgency. It was close enough to allow repeated visits, yet distant enough to preserve the illusion of separation. Proximity had made preparation possible. Distance now made concealment easier. Blackwood considered what the brother must have known in the moment he removed the documents. He would have understood their value, not as abstract information, but as opportunity. Documents of national importance do not exist without consequence. Their possession alone creates leverage. Their transfer creates profit. Such profit rarely exists within national borders alone, which meant that the brothers' actions had likely extended beyond the ministry long before the documents themselves had vanished. Preparation for transfer requires time. It requires contact. It requires assurance that what has been taken can be delivered safely and exchanged without interruption. These arrangements are not created in haste. They are constructed gradually, with the same quiet patience that had defined his repeated visits to the ministry itself. Blackwood paused at the edge of the street and allowed the full structure of the realization to settle into place. The disappearance had not been an isolated act of impulse. It had been the final step in a longer process, one shaped by familiarity, proximity, and calculated intention. The brother had not acted without understanding consequence. He had acted because he believed consequence would never reach him. Trust had given him access. Routine had given him opportunity. And accusation had given him concealment. Yet concealment built upon assumption rarely remains permanent. Blackwood understood now that the truth had already begun to emerge, not through force, but through alignment. Each observation had moved the case closer to its natural conclusion. The ministry had revealed how the act had been carried out. The brother's life had revealed why. What remained now was not to discover the disappearance itself, but to allow the quiet certainty of understanding to reach the place where accusation could no longer remain misdirected. There are actions whose true purpose does not reveal itself at the moment they are committed, but only afterward, when the person who carried them out begins to move differently within the quiet structure of their own life. Blackwood understood that the disappearance of the documents had not been the end of the brother's intention. It had been the beginning of its final phase. Documents of such importance do not hold value merely by being taken. Their value exists only in their transfer, and transfer requires careful preparation, precise timing, and contact beyond the ordinary boundaries of routine. The brother had not fled. He had remained within London, continuing to occupy the same spaces he had always occupied. His presence had remained visible, his routine outwardly intact. This was not the behavior of someone acting without control. It was the behavior of someone who understood that absence invites suspicion, while presence preserves concealment. By remaining near his familiar surroundings, he had allowed accusation to remain directed elsewhere, toward the man whose access had made him the most convenient explanation. Yet Blackwood understood that concealment does not exist without adjustment. Even the most careful plan introduces small deviations in routine, and routine, when observed with patience, reveals those deviations with quiet certainty. He began to study the brother's recent movements with the same calm attention he had given to the ministry itself. He did not look for dramatic change. He looked for subtle alteration in timing, in direction, in habit. It was within these quiet alterations that the pattern emerged. There had been an evening, shortly after the disappearance, when the brother had left his residence later than usual. His departure had not been hurried. It had followed the calm, measured pace of someone whose movement required no urgency. He had walked alone, following streets that did not belong to his ordinary routine, entering a district of the city where his presence had never before been recorded. The district itself was quiet, removed from the visible structure of government and commerce. Its buildings stood close together, their windows reflecting only the steady glow of street lamps. It was a place where individuals could move without attracting attention, not because they were concealed, but because nothing in the environment demanded observation. Blackwood walked those same streets, allowing the quiet structure of the place to settle into his understanding. He understood why such a location would be chosen. Meetings arranged for discretion rarely occur in places defined by urgency. They occur in places defined by stillness, where presence becomes indistinguishable from continuation. The brother had remained there for less than an hour. He had not stayed long enough to create pattern. He had stayed long enough to create certainty. Blackwood understood that the brother had not needed to deliver the documents during that meeting. He had needed only to confirm that delivery would be possible. Such confirmation does not require physical exchange. It requires only agreement. Agreement that the documents existed. Agreement that they remained within his possession. Agreement that the next step could proceed without interruption. He allowed his thoughts to align fully with the structure of the realization now forming. The disappearance had not been an act completed in isolation. It had been an act connected to a larger intention, one that extended beyond the ministry, beyond accusation, and beyond the quiet assumption of innocence that had protected him until now. Preparation had created opportunity. Opportunity had created absence. Absence had created accusation. And accusation had created time. Time enough for the brother to begin the final stage of his intention. Blackwood understood now that the act of theft had not been the most difficult part of the plan. The most difficult part had been remaining ordinary afterward. remaining calm, remaining present, remaining within the quiet structure of expectation long enough to ensure that suspicion did not return to its true source. Yet routine, once disturbed, does not restore itself perfectly. It reveals its fracture through time. And somewhere within the quiet continuation of the brother's life, that fracture had already begun to widen, carrying with it the quiet certainty that concealment, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot remain complete forever. There is a quiet moment in every carefully constructed deception when the same routine that once provided protection begins, almost imperceptibly, to withdraw it. Blackwood understood that the brother's actions had depended entirely upon familiarity. Familiarity had allowed him to move freely within the ministry, to walk its corridors without hesitation, and to exist within its structure without ever appearing out of place. It had allowed him to observe without scrutiny and, at the precise moment required, to remove what did not belong to him without disturbing the order that surrounded him. For a time, that same familiarity had continued to preserve him, allowing suspicion to remain directed toward the man whose authority had made the disappearance seem plausible. Yet routine, once disturbed by intention, never restores itself perfectly. It continues outwardly, but it carries within it a subtle imbalance that reveals itself only through time. Blackwood had already begun to see that imbalance in the brothers' movements. The deviation had not been dramatic. It had not required sudden disappearance or visible flight. Instead, it had emerged through small alterations, quiet adjustments that did not interrupt routine entirely, but weakened its certainty. The late walk into an unfamiliar district had been one such alteration. It had not been the act of a man seeking escape. It had been the act of a man preparing completion. Completion requires transition. A man who has taken something of great value cannot remain indefinitely within the same structure that allowed him to take it. He must eventually carry it beyond the boundaries of familiarity and into the uncertainty that lies beyond protection. And in doing so, he must accept that the very act of departure creates the first true disruption in his routine. Blackwood returned again to the quiet street where the brother lived, allowing himself to observe without intrusion. The structure of the neighborhood remained unchanged, its stillness preserving the illusion that nothing within it had shifted. Windows reflected the steady glow of street lamps. Doors remained closed. The night carried forward with the calm continuity that defined London's quieter hours. Yet absence, when expected presence fails to appear, reveals itself with quiet clarity. The brothers' home remained dark. This darkness was not unusual in itself. Homes enter darkness each night without consequence. Yet routine gives darkness its meaning. A house that follows predictable hours of light and rest becomes familiar to those who observe it. When that pattern alters, even slightly, the alteration carries significance. Blackwood remained there long enough to confirm what routine itself had begun to reveal. The brother had left earlier than expected. He had not returned. This was not the absence of sleep. It was the absence of continuation. Blackwood understood that the brothers' plan had reached its final stage. The documents could not remain indefinitely within his possession. Their value depended upon transfer. Transfer required movement beyond the safety of familiarity. And movement beyond familiarity introduces uncertainty, no matter how carefully it is planned. He did not pursue the brother through the city streets. Pursuit belongs to urgency, and urgency was no longer required. The structure of the case had already resolved itself. The ministry had revealed how the act had been carried out. The brother's routine had revealed who had carried it out. And now his absence revealed the final confirmation. Departure does not conceal truth. It completes it. Blackwood returned once more to the ministry, walking its corridors with the same quiet patience that had guided him from the beginning. The building remained unchanged, its order preserved, its silence complete. The deputy minister's office remained as it had been, its absence undisturbed, its structure intact. Nothing within the building acknowledged the truth. Yet the truth had never belonged to the building alone. It had belonged to the pattern of familiarity that had surrounded it. Blackwood stood for a moment within the quiet corridor, allowing the final alignment of understanding to settle into certainty. The brother had entered the ministry not as an intruder, but as someone accepted. He had learned its rhythms without resistance. He had observed its vulnerabilities without ever appearing to seek them. And when the moment arrived, he had acted not with force, but with calm certainty. His success had depended entirely upon remaining within routine. Now, in leaving it behind, he had removed his final protection. Blackwood turned and walked slowly toward the exit, his steps steady, his thoughts resolved. The accusation that had fallen upon the deputy minister had never been supported by truth. It had been supported by proximity and assumption. Yet assumption, when examined with patience, cannot preserve itself indefinitely. Routine reveals what force cannot. And now, at last, the quiet certainty that had once protected the wrong man had begun to dissolve, replaced by the clearer and more permanent structure of truth. There is a quiet certainty that emerges when disorder, having existed long enough to create doubt, finally begins to return to its proper place. Blackwood had understood from the earliest moments of the case that the disappearance of the documents had not been an act of chaos. It had been an act of precision. Precision does not belong to randomness. It belongs to intention, and intention, no matter how carefully concealed, leaves behind a structure that can be understood when observed with patience. The ministry itself had never truly lost its order. It had only misidentified where that order had been broken. Its corridors had remained unchanged. Its guards had maintained their posts. Its doors had continued to open and close with the same quiet regularity they had followed for years. The system had continued to function exactly as it had been designed to function. And yet within that quiet continuity, a single act had introduced imbalance. Imbalance, once introduced, cannot remain invisible forever. Blackwood returned once more to the office where absence had first been discovered, not because he expected to find anything new, but because completion requires acknowledgement. The room remained unchanged. The desk stood in its familiar position, its surface undisturbed except for the quiet and permanent absence of what had once rested there. The chair remained slightly withdrawn, preserving the final posture of routine interrupted without warning. Nothing in the room suggested violence. Nothing suggested intrusion. The absence had never belonged to force. It had belonged to familiarity. The brother had entered this room not as a stranger, but as someone accepted by the structure that surrounded him. His presence had not introduced uncertainty. It had satisfied expectation. He had moved within the ministry not by defeating its security, but by becoming part of its routine. And in doing so, he had discovered the one vulnerability no system can fully eliminate. Trust allows movement without resistance. Trust allows observation without suspicion. Trust allows preparation without interruption. And trust, when misused, allows absence to form without immediate explanation. For a time, that trust had protected him completely. Suspicion had settled naturally upon the deputy minister, whose authority had made disappearance possible in the eyes of the system that had accused him. Access had created assumption. Assumption had created accusation. And accusation had provided concealment for the man who had never needed authority at all. Yet routine does not accept deviation indefinitely. It continues outwardly, preserving its structure, until the quiet imbalance within it becomes too precise to ignore. Blackwood had seen that imbalance not in the building, but in the pattern of presence that surrounded it. The brothers' visits had formed their own quiet rhythm. His familiarity had created its own structure. And when that structure had shifted, when routine had altered, when presence had become absence, the truth had begun to emerge. He walked slowly through the corridor for the final time, allowing the quiet certainty of completion to settle fully into place. The ministry would correct itself. The accusation placed upon the deputy minister would dissolve as the structure of familiarity revealed its true shape. The registry would be examined again, not as a record of harmless visits, but as a record of preparation. Each entry would take on new meaning. Each moment of acceptance would be understood not as routine, but as opportunity carefully observed. Outside, London remained unchanged. The streets carried forward their quiet continuity. Lamps illuminated the pavement with the same calm certainty they had always provided. Buildings stood in silent alignment with the passage of time. Nothing in the city announced resolution. Nothing needed to. Resolution belongs not to sound, but to understanding. Somewhere beyond the city's quiet structure, the brothers' movement would come to its inevitable end. His plan had depended upon remaining within routine. His concealment had depended upon familiarity. But in leaving that familiarity behind, he had revealed the one thing he could never fully control. Pattern. Pattern had revealed his access. Pattern had revealed his preparation. And pattern had revealed his absence. Blackwood stepped outside and allowed himself one final moment of stillness beneath the quiet glow of the street lamps. The case had never required pursuit. It had required patience. It had required the willingness to observe routine until routine itself revealed where it had been broken. This had never been a case about theft alone. It had been a case about belonging, about the quiet authority of familiarity, and about the certainty with which truth restores itself when routine is finally understood. Blackwood turned and walked into the quiet London night, his presence dissolving once more into the same calm continuity that had allowed him to see what others had missed. Behind him, the ministry remained as it had always been. Order had returned. Routine had restored itself. And the quiet balance of the nation remained intact once more. If you found calm in this quiet investigation, and if you would like to follow Detective Blackwood into the next mystery waiting within the silent streets of London, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your presence ensures that you will not miss the next case, already waiting to reveal itself in the stillness.